When we think about a Buddha, we often imagine a singular, almost timeless figure, a unique savior appearing once in history, delivering a message that should last forever. But early Buddhism presents something far more subtle and, in a way, far more unsettling. A Buddha does not remain in the world. His teaching does not remain in the world. Even truth, though timeless in itself, does not remain visible forever. This is where our question begins. If reality does not change, why must awakening be rediscovered again and again? In the early Pāli tradition, preserved in texts such as the Vipassī within the Kintang Pāli, we are told that before Thích Ca Mâu Ni appeared in our world, many Buddhas had already arisen in distant ages. These were not disciples of one another. They were not inheritors of an unbroken institutional lineage. Each one emerged in a time when the teaching had completely vanished, when the path to liberation was no longer known, when the world had forgotten how to see clearly. This detail is crucial. A Buddha does not come to improve an existing religion. A Buddha appears when there is nothing left to improve. This idea challenges a common religious assumption, that once divine truth is revealed, it should endure permanently. In the Buddhist understanding, the problem is not that truth decays. Truth does not decay. Impermanence does not erase reality. What fades is human understanding. What disappears is the living realization of Dhamma. Over generations, direct insight is replaced by memory. Memory is replaced by ritual. Ritual is replaced by empty form. Gradually, the words may remain, but the meaning dissolves. Eventually, even the words are lost. Why does this happen? Because ignorance, in Buddhism, is not a historical accident. It is a structural condition of unenlightened mind. Ignorance is not defeated once and for all by the appearance of a teacher. It recedes when wisdom is cultivated, and it returns when mindfulness weakens. Entire civilizations can be guided by ethical clarity for centuries, yet slowly drift back into confusion as greed, hatred, and delusion reassert themselves. The disappearance of Dhamma is not a punishment. It is not divine withdrawal. It is the natural consequence of causes and conditions. The early texts describe a world in which the teaching flourishes for a time after a Buddha's awakening. There are disciples who attain liberation. There is a Sangha that preserves discipline. There is moral coherence in society. But centuries pass. Fewer people practice deeply. The teachings become more intellectual than experiential. Debates replace meditation. Identity replaces inquiry. Eventually, there are no more arahants, no more fully awakened disciples. When the last person capable of direct realization passes away, something subtle but decisive has ended. The path is no longer visible in lived experience. It exists only as shadow. And shadows do not last forever. This is why multiple Buddhas appear across vast stretches of cosmic time. The tradition remembers figures such as Vipassī, Sikhī, Vessabhū, Kakusandha, Koṇāgamana, and Kassapa. Each arose in a different era, under different social and cosmic conditions. Each rediscovered the same fundamental truths: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self. Each established a community. Each eventually passed away. And in time, each of their teachings faded from the world. This cycle is not presented as tragedy. It is presented as lawfulness. Everything conditioned is impermanent. Institutions are conditioned. Scriptures are conditioned. Even collective memory is conditioned. If the Dhamma is to remain alive, it must be embodied in living practice. When embodiment disappears, knowledge becomes abstraction. When abstraction dominates, realization ceases. When realization ceases, liberation becomes myth. So we return to the central tension. If truth is timeless, why must it be rediscovered? Because timeless truth does not automatically translate into timeless awareness. The Four Noble Truths are not dependent on culture, but the capacity to see them clearly depends on conditions. When conditions deteriorate, clarity vanishes. When clarity vanishes completely, Only a being of extraordinary cultivation, one who has perfected wisdom across inconceivable spans of time, can rediscover the path without guidance. This is the radical implication. Enlightenment is not sustained by revelation alone. It must be renewed. Not because reality changes, but because beings forget. The disappearance of Dhamma is therefore not evidence of its weakness. It is evidence of the fragility of human mindfulness. We do not remain awake by default. Societies do not remain ethical by default. Even profound insights, if not practiced, decay into slogans. And slogans cannot liberate anyone. To understand why the world needs many Buddhas, we must first accept this uncomfortable truth. Awakening is rare, and forgetfulness is ordinary. The appearance of a Buddha is not the beginning of truth. It is the reillumination of a path that has been buried under layers of neglect. Over time, the path becomes overgrown again. The forest returns. The markings fade. Travelers wander without direction. Then, in another age, another being awakens and clears the way once more. The world does not need many Buddhas because truth is unstable. The world needs many Buddhas because ignorance is persistent. And as long as ignorance can return, the possibility of rediscovery must also remain. This is not a story about divine intervention. It is a story about cyclical amnesia, and the extraordinary courage required to remember. If we are to understand why the world needs many Buddhas, we must look more deeply at what a Buddha actually is. In popular imagination, a Buddha can easily be reduced to a saint, a prophet, or a religious founder. But in early Buddhism, the concept is far more radical. A Sammasambuddha, a perfectly self-awakened one, is not merely a teacher who refines existing wisdom. He is one who rediscovers the entire path to liberation without guidance, in a world where that path has completely vanished. This is not simply spiritual achievement. It is a cosmic event. A Buddha does not receive revelation from a higher power. He does not inherit scripture from a previous era. He does not awaken within a living lineage. The defining characteristic of a Sammasambuddha is precisely this. There is no teacher above him, no doctrine available to consult, no map to follow. The Dhamma has disappeared entirely. The path has been lost to history. And yet, through the perfection of wisdom cultivated across inconceivable stretches of time, he penetrates reality directly and rediscovers the same timeless truths that previous Buddhas once realized. This rediscovery is central. Truth itself does not change. Impermanence remains impermanent. Suffering remains bound to craving. Non-self remains the nature of conditioned phenomena. But the knowledge of how to see this clearly, how to train the mind, how to dismantle ignorance, how to walk step by step toward Nibbana, that knowledge is fragile. When it vanishes from the world, no amount of intellectual speculation can restore it. Only direct awakening can reopen the path. This is why the appearance of a Buddha is described as exceedingly rare. The early discourses use powerful imagery to communicate this rarity, such as the famous simile of a blind turtle surfacing once every 100 years in a vast ocean, accidentally placing its neck through a single floating yoke. The point is not statistical probability. The point is existential preciousness. A Buddha does not arise simply because suffering exists. Suffering always exists. A Buddha arises only when the necessary causes and conditions converge, when the Dhamma has fully disappeared. When beings possess sufficient maturity to understand it again, and when one individual has completed the vast cultivation required to rediscover it. The tradition remembers past Buddhas such as Vipassī, Sikhī, Vessabhū, Kakusandha, Koṇāgamana, and Kassapa, each arising in a different cosmic era. These figures are not presented as variations of one personality. They are embodiments of a recurring phenomenon, when ignorance blankets the world completely, and yet conditions ripen, awakening erupts again. And when Thích Ca Mâu Ni appeared in our age, he did not claim uniqueness in an absolute sense. He acknowledged that others had come before, and that others would come after. This humility is doctrinally significant. It reframes Buddhahood not as divine singularity, but as lawful recurrence. To call a Buddha a cosmic reset is not poetic exaggeration. When a Buddha awakens, he does more than attain personal liberation. An arahant, too, becomes fully liberated, but an arahant does so by following a path already shown. A Sammasambuddha, by contrast, uncovers the path itself and then establishes a living community capable of preserving and transmitting it. He articulates the structure of suffering, clarifies its causes, demonstrates its cessation, and lays out a practical method for realization. In doing so, he reorders the moral and spiritual landscape of the world. Before a Buddha arises, there may be philosophies, rituals, metaphysical systems, and spiritual practices. But none of them lead fully to the ending of suffering. After a Buddha teaches, there exists, for a time, a clear and direct route to liberation. This is not a minor contribution. It is the reopening of possibility. The existence of even a single fully awakened being alters the trajectory of countless lives. Those who encounter the Dhamma and practice earnestly can break free from the endless cycle of birth and death. The presence of a Buddha is therefore not merely inspirational, it is transformative at the deepest existential level. Yet this transformation is not permanent on a collective scale. A Buddha does not eliminate ignorance from the universe. He reveals the cure, but beings must take it. Some do. Many do not. Over generations, the clarity of the teaching depends on practice. If practice declines, realization declines. If realization declines, understanding weakens. Eventually, the teaching becomes a historical artifact rather than a living path. And when no one remains who can penetrate the truth directly, the era of that Buddha effectively ends. This brings us back to the nature of a Buddha as a lawful event rather than a divine exception. A Buddha is not sent into the world by a creator deity. Buddhism does not posit a supreme will deciding when humanity deserves guidance. Instead, the arising of a Buddha is conditioned, just like everything else. It depends on the maturity of collective karma, on the readiness of beings, and on the completion of vast perfections by one individual who has resolved, countless lifetimes earlier, to rediscover the Dhamma for the welfare of many. Thus, the appearance of a Buddha is neither random nor guaranteed. It is conditional. When the world sinks into spiritual darkness, that darkness alone is not enough to produce light. Conditions must ripen. Wisdom must mature somewhere within the vast web of existence. And when those conditions converge, awakening breaks through. Understanding this shifts our perception dramatically. A Buddha is not merely an extraordinary person within history. A Buddha is the reemergence of forgotten knowledge. He is the restoration of a path that had vanished. He is proof that ignorance, however pervasive, is not ultimate. But he is also proof that awakening does not perpetuate itself automatically. This is why one Buddha is never enough for eternity. Not because his realization is incomplete, but because conditioned existence does not sustain clarity indefinitely. The law of impermanence applies even to the most sublime teachings. And so, when the Dhamma disappears completely, the world waits, not for divine intervention, but for conditions to ripen once more. A Buddha arises when causes align. He rediscovers what was always true. He teaches what had been forgotten. And for a time, the path is visible again. To understand why many Buddhas arise across vast stretches of time, we must expand our perspective beyond human history and into Buddhist cosmology. The early teachings describe reality not as a linear progression toward improvement or decline, but as an immense rhythmic process unfolding over inconceivable cycles known as kappas, eons of expansion and contraction, formation and dissolution. Within these vast cycles, civilizations rise and fall, moral clarity strengthens and weakens, lifespans increase and decrease, and spiritual knowledge appears and disappears. The universe, in this vision, is not static. It breathes. A kappa is not merely a poetic metaphor for time. It represents durations so immense that ordinary imagination cannot grasp them. Texts describe cosmic contraction, when worlds dissolve, followed by cosmic expansion, when worlds reform and beings reappear according to their karma. Within these expansions, societies develop, flourish, decay, and vanish. The appearance of a Buddha does not occur randomly within this cycle. It occurs at specific points when conditions ripen in a very particular way, when ignorance is widespread. Yet the potential for understanding has matured sufficiently. This dynamic relationship between decline and readiness is subtle. If beings are too morally degraded, too consumed by violence and confusion, they lack the capacity to comprehend profound truths. If they are too comfortable, too immersed in pleasure and abundance, they may feel no urgency to seek liberation. The emergence of a Buddha requires a delicate balance. Suffering must be visible enough to provoke inquiry. Yet minds must retain enough clarity to understand the answer. The early tradition often links these cosmic rhythms with changes in human lifespan. In the era of past Buddhas such as Vipassī, it is said that human beings lived for tens of thousands of years. As ages pass, lifespans gradually shorten. By the time of Thích Ca Mâu Ni, the human lifespan had decreased dramatically. This detail should not be interpreted simplistically as biological data. Rather, it symbolizes the moral and psychological density of the age. Long lifespans reflect subtler minds, less dominated by coarse craving and aggression. As greed and hatred intensify across generations, lifespans shorten. Violence increases. Instability grows. Society becomes spiritually fragile. In this framework, moral decline is not a punishment inflicted from outside. It is the natural result of collective karma. When individuals repeatedly act out of craving and delusion, those tendencies accumulate socially. Structures built on wisdom gradually erode. Ethical discipline weakens. Mindfulness fades. The Dhamma, even if still remembered in words, becomes increasingly misunderstood. Eventually, it disappears entirely. Yet the cycle does not end in permanent darkness. As decline reaches extreme depths, suffering becomes undeniable. When suffering intensifies to the point where beings begin to question their own patterns, seeds of transformation are planted. At the same time, somewhere within the vast continuum of rebirth, an individual who has been cultivating parami, the perfections of generosity, morality, patience, determination, wisdom, and compassion, over immeasurable lifetimes approaches completion. When that cultivation ripens in a world that is ready, awakening occurs again. Thus, the appearance of a Buddha is intertwined with cosmic rhythm. It is neither a miraculous interruption nor a linear step forward in progress. It is a turning point within a recurring pattern. Just as the universe expands and contracts, so too does clarity expand and contract within collective consciousness. Wisdom does not permanently defeat ignorance on a universal scale. It reemerges when conditions allow. This cyclical view prevents both despair and complacency. It prevents despair because decline is never final. However dark an era becomes, the lawfulness of reality ensures that causes can give rise to awakening again. But it also prevents complacency, because no era of clarity is guaranteed to endure. Even the presence of a fully awakened Buddha does not freeze the world into perpetual enlightenment. The teaching flourishes only as long as it is practiced. The breathing universe described in Buddhist cosmology is therefore moral as well as physical. Expansion and contraction are not merely astronomical events, they are psychological and ethical shifts. When ignorance thickens, suffering intensifies. When wisdom reappears, suffering can be understood and transcended. The cycle continues, not as endless repetition without meaning, but as lawful unfolding driven by causes and conditions. Seen from this perspective, the existence of many Buddhas across different kappas is not extraordinary in the sense of being arbitrary. It is extraordinary in its rarity, but natural in its occurrence. Just as storms arise when atmospheric conditions converge, a Buddha arises when spiritual conditions converge. The universe does not move steadily upward toward perfection, nor does it slide irreversibly into ruin. It oscillates. And within that oscillation, awakening appears again and again. Understanding the law of kappa reshapes our sense of time. We are not living at the climax of history, nor at its end. We are situated within a vast process that has unfolded long before our era and will continue long after. Buddhas have arisen in past expansions. They will arise in future expansions. The Dhamma has vanished before. It will vanish again. Yet each time it reappears, it reveals the same truth, that suffering arises from ignorance, and that ignorance can be ended. The breathing of the cosmos mirrors the breathing of the mind. Clarity emerges, fades, and emerges again. On the grandest scale, this rhythm explains why many Buddhas are necessary. Not because truth evolves, but because conditions fluctuate. And as long as conditions fluctuate, the possibility of forgetting and rediscovering remains woven into the fabric of existence itself. If we now return to the central question, why is one Buddha not enough? The answer becomes clearer yet more profound. It is not because a Buddha's realization is incomplete. It is not because the Dhamma requires revision. It is not because truth evolves with time. Rather, it is because impermanence applies to conditioned existence in every dimension, including human understanding. The teaching of a Buddha is perfect in its insight, but its presence in the world is conditioned. And whatever is conditioned cannot remain unchanged forever. When a Buddha such as Thích Ca Mâu Ni awakens and teaches, the path to liberation becomes visible again. The Four Noble Truths are articulated. The Noble Eightfold Path is clarified. A living community forms. For a time, there are individuals who practice sincerely and realize the Dhamma directly. In that period, the teaching is not merely philosophy. It is embodied experience. The truth lives in minds that have seen it. But embodiment is fragile. Over generations, even the most luminous tradition depends on memory, interpretation, and institutional preservation. As long as there are practitioners who attain awakening, the Dhamma remains alive. Yet as fewer individuals practice deeply, realization becomes rarer. Teachings are studied, analyzed, debated, and organized, but not necessarily penetrated. Gradually, subtle shifts occur. Language is preserved, but insight weakens. Forms remain, but direct seeing fades. This is not a failure of the Buddha. It is a reflection of the nature of conditioned beings. Ignorance does not vanish permanently because it is rooted in craving and misperception. Tendencies that can reassert themselves whenever mindfulness declines. Entire cultures can drift from simplicity to complexity, from clarity to distraction. New attachments emerge. Old disciplines loosen. What was once a path becomes an identity. What was once liberation becomes heritage. Impermanence does not spare sacred institutions. Even the purest doctrine cannot enforce its own continuity. The Dhamma does not impose itself on unwilling minds. It requires practice, inquiry, courage. When those qualities diminish collectively, the teaching dims. Eventually, a point may be reached where no one fully understands the path anymore. At that moment, the era of that Buddha has effectively ended, even if fragments of memory remain. This is why one Buddha cannot be sufficient for all eternity. Not because his insight lacks power, but because the world does not sustain clarity indefinitely. Each era presents unique psychological conditions. The forms of delusion change. The structures of society shift. The ways in which craving manifests evolve. A teaching must be rediscovered in a way that speaks directly to the specific conditions of that time. Although the core truths remain identical, impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, non-self, their rediscovery requires fresh penetration. The tradition's remembrance of past Buddhas such as Vipassī, Sikhī, Vessabhū, Kakusandha, Koṇāgamana, and Kassapa is not merely mythic storytelling. It conveys a structural truth: ignorance returns, and awakening must reappear. This recurring pattern is not pessimistic. It is realistic. It acknowledges that the human condition is dynamic and unstable. No single historical intervention permanently secures liberation for all beings. In some religious worldviews, revelation is conceived as a one-time event that permanently defines humanity's relationship to ultimate reality. In contrast, Buddhism does not rest on the idea of a final, unrepeatable disclosure. Instead, it rests on causality. When causes are present, awakening occurs. When causes are absent, ignorance dominates. This makes the appearance of many Buddhas not an anomaly, but a necessity within the logic of dependent origination. Compassion, in this context, is not limited to one historical figure. The existence of multiple Buddhas across vast ages demonstrates that awakening is not monopolized. It is not reserved for a singular, irreplaceable being. It is a possibility woven into the structure of existence itself. Each Buddha rediscovers the same path, not to replace the previous one, but because the previous one has vanished. Truth does not compete with itself across eras. It simply reemerges when forgotten. To say that one Buddha is not enough is therefore to recognize the persistence of ignorance. As long as beings continue to be born under the influence of craving and delusion, clarity must be renewed. A single sunrise does not illuminate the world forever. Night inevitably returns. And when night returns, dawn must come again. This perspective also reshapes how we understand the teaching we currently possess. The presence of the Dhamma in our era is not guaranteed indefinitely. It is a rare window within an immense cycle. It will not remain forever by default. Its survival depends on practice, realization, and living transmission. If those disappear, the teaching will fade just as it has faded before. Thus, the necessity of many Buddhas is not a commentary on the insufficiency of any one of them. It is a commentary on the nature of samsara. Conditioned existence does not preserve wisdom permanently. Clarity must be rediscovered whenever it is lost. And as long as impermanence governs all compounded phenomena, the world will continue to require the reappearance of awakening. What does all of this mean for us here and now? If many Buddhas have arisen in the past, and many will arise in the future, where do we stand within this immense unfolding? According to the tradition, we are living in the era of Thích Ca Mâu Ni, a rare and precious window in which the Dhamma is still accessible. The path has been rediscovered. The teachings have been preserved. The method leading to liberation remains available. But this availability is not permanent. It is conditional, fragile, and subject to the same law of impermanence that governs everything else. To understand this is to feel both gratitude and urgency. Gratitude, because the appearance of a Sammasambuddha in any age is extraordinarily rare. Urgency, because the presence of the teaching does not guarantee that it will remain clear indefinitely. The pattern we have explored is not theoretical. It is cyclical. The Dhamma flourishes, declines, disappears, and reemerges across vast spans of time. We are not spectators of this process. We are participants within it. There is also the promise of a future Buddha, remembered in the tradition as Mattiya. His coming is described as a time when human lifespans will increase again, when moral conduct will strengthen, and when conditions will once more support deep spiritual realization. But this expectation should not be misunderstood as an invitation to postpone practice. The future Buddha does not serve as an escape from present responsibility. If anything, his anticipated arrival underscores the cyclical nature of forgetting and rediscovery. By the time he appears, the current Dhamma will have vanished entirely. The teachings available to us now will no longer be accessible. Waiting for another Buddha would mean passing through long ages without guidance. The deeper message, then, is not about chronology. It is about potential. The existence of many Buddhas across different eras demonstrates something extraordinary. Awakening is not a singular accident in cosmic history. It is repeatable. It has occurred before. It will occur again. And that repeatability reveals something profound about human nature. The capacity for complete liberation is embedded within the structure of mind itself. It is not bestowed from outside. It is uncovered from within. If awakening were unique to one being, it might suggest that liberation is exceptional in an absolute sense, unreachable for ordinary individuals. But the cycle of many Buddhas tells a different story. It tells us that under the right conditions, with the right cultivation, ignorance can be penetrated fully. The path is not dependent on divine favor. It is dependent on understanding. What has been realized before can be realized again because the laws governing suffering and its cessation do not change. At the same time, the existence of multiple Buddhas across time should not lull us into complacency. The fact that awakening will reappear in distant ages does not diminish the urgency of this moment. Each human life is brief. Each era of available Dhamma is finite. The rarity of encountering a living teaching that points directly to liberation is emphasized repeatedly in the early discourses. To be born at a time when a Buddha's dispensation still exists is considered an extraordinary opportunity. We stand, therefore, in a delicate position. The path has been revealed. The instructions are present. The community of practice exists. But decline is inevitable if vigilance weakens. The cycle does not halt simply because we understand it intellectually. If we neglect practice, if we reduce the Dhamma to cultural identity or philosophical speculation, we contribute to the gradual fading of living insight. If we practice sincerely, embody mindfulness, and cultivate wisdom, we participate in sustaining clarity within this era. The world needs many Buddhas not because truth evolves, but because beings forget. And forgetting is happening constantly, not only across cosmic eons, but within individual lives. Each moment of heedlessness is a small disappearance of Dhamma. Each moment of clear seeing is a small rediscovery. On the grand scale, Buddhas arise when collective forgetfulness reaches totality. On the personal scale, awakening begins when individual forgetfulness is interrupted. In this sense, the vast cosmological story mirrors our immediate experience. Just as entire civilizations can lose sight of the path, so can a single mind. And just as a Buddha rediscovers what was always true, so too can we begin to see directly what has always been present, impermanence unfolding. Craving generating suffering, awareness capable of release. The recurring appearance of Buddhas across time is not merely a mythic narrative. It is a reminder of possibility. It tells us that no matter how obscured truth becomes, it is never destroyed. It can be uncovered again. The question is not whether another Buddha will arise in some distant future. The question is whether we will use the conditions available now to walk the path already revealed. The world has needed many Buddhas because ignorance persists. But the fact that awakening continues to reappear across immeasurable ages means that ignorance is never ultimate. And within that realization lies both responsibility and hope.